In the pre-dawn darkness, a young Comanche warrior crouches low behind his more experienced companions, his fingers tightening around his bow. His heart pounds against his ribs as he watches the seasoned warriors ahead move like shadows across the prairie grass. Though trained since childhood for moments like this, his hands tremble slightly. This raid will mark his passage into true warriorhood. The Comanche war party hasn't chosen this path lightly. Their mission burns with purpose. 3 of their own were taken just days ago, their fate unknown. But whispered stories of the Takua's treatment of captives fuel their determination. Every warrior knows the tales, stories too horrific to ignore. As they draw closer, the scene before them comes into sharp focus. Takua warriors cluster around a blazing fire, their faces illuminated by dancing flames. Others rest in their hide shelters, unaware of the death approaching from the darkness. The air is thick with wood smoke and the quiet murmur of conversation. The silence shatters like thunder. The Comanche war cry erupts from dozens of throats at once, a sound designed to freeze the blood of enemies. The effect is immediate. The Takua camp erupts in chaos, warriors scrambling for weapons as women and children flee into the darkness. Experienced Comanche warriors surge forward, their arrows finding targets with deadly precision as the Takua scatter in terror. But the young warrior remains frozen, watching as his companions disappear into the chaos of battle. His feet carry him forward toward the abandoned camp. The fire still burns bright, and something about its flames draws his attention. As he approaches, his blood turns to ice. There, roasting over the crackling flames, is a sight that will haunt him forever. The dismembered leg of a Comanche warrior, one of their missing brothers, being prepared as food. This account, chronicled in the pages of 7 Years Among the Indians, reveals a brutal truth about frontier warfare. The Takua were indeed cannibals, and this discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the balance of power in the American Southwest. The authenticity of these accounts rests substantially on the testimony of Herman Lehman, a young white settler whose life took an extraordinary turn when he was captured by Comanche raiders. Throughout his years living among the Comanche people, Lehman became fully immersed in their culture, learning their language, customs, and ways of warfare. His detailed documentation of the Takua's practices as man-eaters stands as one of several corroborating accounts from the period, painting a picture of practices that most civilizations had long abandoned. The question emerges, how does one respond to discovering such neighbors? As we explore this complex historical narrative, we must first understand the intricate web of family connections that shaped these events. Welcome to Histories and Native Tales. The significance of family lineage threads through every aspect of this history. Consider the profound influence of Peter Nakona and Cynthia Ann Parker on their son, Quanah Parker, who would become the most renowned Comanche chief. Their family narrative exemplifies how individual lives intertwined to shape the broader tapestry of American frontier history. The tensions between these communities reached a devastating climax in 1862 during the tumultuous years of the American Civil War. A formidable coalition of Native American warriors, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage fighters, launched a coordinated assault on Confederate Fort Cobb in Oklahoma Territory. The attack served as a prelude to an even more tragic event. Along the meandering Washita River, approximately 300 members of the Tonkawa tribe had established their camp, unaware of the impending danger. Having achieved their objectives at Fort Cobb, the war party redirected their focus southward toward the Tonkawa encampment. The Tonkawa, caught completely unprepared and lacking sufficient weapons, faced overwhelming odds. The ensuing massacre transformed the peaceful river valley into a scene of unprecedented carnage. The aftermath left the fields near Washita River as a vast bone field, with skeletal remains scattered across the hillside. John Clark, a local resident who witnessed this grim scene, would later testify that the skeletons remained exactly where the Tonkawa had fallen during the massacre, their bones bleaching under the prairie sun. His eyewitness account stands as one of the most sobering testimonies to the scale and brutality of the attack. John Clark's testimony painted a haunting picture of the massacre's aftermath. The skeletons lay scattered across the hillside in the exact positions where each Tonkawa person had fallen, creating a frozen tableau of the tribe's final moments. The death toll was devastating. 140 Tonkawa men, women, and children perished in the attack, representing nearly half of the tribe's total population. The survivors faced a desperate choice in the aftermath. A small group turned southward, seeking refuge among their Confederate allies who might offer some measure of protection. Others disappeared into the vast frontier, their fates lost to history. This dispersal marked the beginning of the end for the Tonkawa people as a unified tribe. The massacre proved catastrophic for the Tonkawa nation, whose entire population had numbered only a few hundred souls. Such a significant loss of life dealt an insurmountable blow to their survival as a distinct people. The attack effectively ended their existence as an independent tribe, marking one of the most complete destructions of a Native American group in the region's history. The attacking warriors, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage, justified their actions as necessary retribution. They cited the Tonkawa's practice of cannibalism, a custom that surrounding tribes had reluctantly tolerated for generations. The immediate catalyst, they claimed, was the recent killing and consumption of a young Caddo boy. This incident, they maintained, had crossed a final line of tolerance. This incident raises profound questions about the nature of warfare and justice in tribal conflicts. In modern international law, cannibalism stands among the most severe breaches of human rights, categorized alongside other grave violations in conventions governing warfare. However, in the context of 19th century tribal relations, such formal classifications did not exist, leaving each group to determine its own boundaries of acceptable warfare. The broader context of this conflict lay in the complex web of tribal relations across the Southwest. The Tonkawa, like many tribes in the region, existed in a perpetual state of low-intensity warfare. Their semi-agricultural lifestyle meant constant competition for limited resources, leading to frequent violent encounters. In this environment of shifting alliances and enemies, most aspects of tribal relations remained fluid and negotiable. Yet the Tonkawa's practice of cannibalism stood as an immutable aspect of their culture, setting them apart from neighboring tribes who, despite engaging in various forms of warfare, did not share this particular practice. Consider this historical paradox. Why did the surrounding tribes wait until 1862 to strike against the Tonkawa? With only 600 members, the Tonkawa were vastly outnumbered by their neighbors for centuries. If their practices were truly unforgivable, what prevented their destruction during all those years? Perhaps most puzzling of all, if cannibalism was so abhorrent to neighboring tribes, how do we explain their repeated military alliances with the Tonkawa in the decades just before their destruction? These questions reveal a complex web of tribal relations that defies simple explanation. Understanding the Tonkawa's specific practices requires examining the broader historical context of cannibalism in human societies. The Tonkawa's practices differed significantly from other documented instances of cannibalism throughout history. Their actions fell into a distinct category, separate from the desperate measures taken by starving populations throughout recorded history. Historical records document numerous instances of survival cannibalism, each marked by circumstances of extreme deprivation. The winter of 1609 to 1610 in Jamestown Colony saw settlers resort to consuming the dead during what became known as the Starving Time. The Donner Party's tragic winter of 1846 to 1847 in the Sierra Nevada mountains provides another well-documented example. The Ukrainian Holodomor of 1932 to 1933 and the Siege of Stalingrad during World War II represent more recent instances where extreme starvation drove people to these desperate measures. Survival cannibalism emerges from circumstances of absolute desperation rather than cultural practice. In these documented cases, victims were typically those who had already perished from starvation or exposure. The act became a final, desperate measure for survival rather than an intentional taking of life. Records indicate that in most cases of survival cannibalism, those who resorted to it expressed deep trauma and remorse about their actions. This was not the predator's hunt, but the scavenger's bitter harvest, a grim opportunity born from death itself, not a calculated pursuit of human prey. In cases of survival cannibalism, the deceased become an unwilling final offering to the living, their flesh a somber testament to humanity's drive for survival. Yet there exists another, darker category of this practice: pathological cannibalism. This manifestation emerges not from desperation, but from severe psychological disturbance, characterized by individuals whose minds have fractured from societal norms in the most extreme ways possible. These are the infamous cases that populate criminal psychology textbooks. Individuals like Jeffrey Dahmer, whose actions stemmed from profound mental disorders rather than cultural practices. The Tonkawa's practices, however, followed a markedly different pattern. While their actions may seem equally disturbing to modern sensibilities, they operated within a structured cultural framework that sets them apart from such pathological cases. The Tonkawa practiced what anthropologists term institutional or ritual cannibalism, also known as war cannibalism. This form emerged as a deliberate extension of warfare itself. Unlike the desperate acts of the starving or the isolated crimes of disturbed individuals, this practice was woven into the fabric of their military culture. The consumption of human flesh transcended mere sustenance. It represented the ultimate expression of dominance over a defeated enemy. This ritualized practice carried deep symbolic significance beyond mere physical consumption. While the regions where such practices emerged often coincided with protein-scarce environments, the primary motivation wasn't nutritional. Instead, it served as the ultimate demonstration of power, a way to completely subjugate an enemy not just in life, but beyond death. Some tribes believed this practice allowed them to absorb the strength and courage of their fallen foes. Herman Lehman's first-hand account provides a striking illustration of these beliefs in action. He documented a remarkable encounter during a Comanche pursuit of a Tonkawa warrior. This single warrior, perhaps emboldened by his tribe's practices, demonstrated extraordinary prowess in combat, successfully defeating 2 Comanche warriors in individual combat. Even Lehman, writing from the perspective of their enemies, couldn't conceal his grudging admiration for the warrior's fierce capabilities. Lehman's account describes the Tonkawa warrior's extraordinary combat prowess with a mix of fear and reluctant admiration. The warrior's consumption of human flesh, in the observers' minds, had imbued him with supernatural strength. Their shields proved ineffective against his precise shots, as if some dark power guided his aim. Though a third Comanche warrior eventually prevailed, the incident reinforced ancient beliefs about the transformative power of consuming human flesh. This concept of cannibalism as the ultimate expression of dominance resonates throughout humanity's oldest recorded stories. Perhaps its most powerful literary expression appears in Homer's Iliad, where the theme reaches its apex in the confrontation between Achilles and Hector. Following the death of his beloved friend Patroclus, Achilles transforms into something beyond human, driven by a rage that borders on bestial. The culminating scene unfolds with devastating intensity. Achilles, having cornered Hector, drives his spear through his rival's throat. But physical death alone does not satisfy his hunger for vengeance. Standing over his dying enemy, Achilles promises a fate worse than death, that Hector's flesh will become food for dogs and carrion birds. When Hector, with his final breaths, begs for the dignity of proper burial rites to secure his passage to the afterlife, Achilles' response reveals the depths of human capacity for vengeance. Achilles' words capture the raw essence of consumptive revenge. Would that my fury and wrath might drive me to carve your flesh and eat it raw for what you have done. This declaration, though ultimately unfulfilled, represents the absolute pinnacle of dominance over a fallen enemy. Even in merely delegating the consumption to dogs, Achilles ensures Hector's complete degradation. Though the epic concludes with Achilles ultimately returning Hector's body to his father, allowing proper burial rites, the horror of his earlier threat lingers. This ancient text demonstrates how the concept of consuming an enemy's flesh has long represented the ultimate expression of power, a terror that transcends cultural boundaries and spans millennia. The fury Achilles felt at the thought of desecration was not unique to him. In war, every civilization that honors its fallen understands that a man is not merely a lifeless body, discarded and forgotten. To strip away that dignity, to turn a warrior into something that could be consumed, was an act so severe that it demanded a ritual, a purpose, something beyond mere savagery. Without such a ceremony, the very idea of consuming another human would reduce the victor to nothing more than a beast, something primal and unthinking. But with a ritual, it became something else entirely, an assertion of power, an absorption of strength, a message of terror sent to every enemy who might dare to challenge them. For those who engaged in this practice, the ceremony was not just about the act itself, it was about what came after. It was about inheritance, the belief that consuming the flesh of a fallen foe allowed the victor to take on the strengths, the skills, the very essence of the defeated. It was a practice meant to ensure that the warrior lived on, in body if not in soul. But it was also a warning, an ever-present shadow over those who feared such a fate. The thought of being reduced to nothing more than meat, of having one's body devoured, was a horror that struck deeper than death itself. It was an insult beyond words, one that reached beyond the physical world and into the spiritual. Throughout history, nearly every civilization developed burial customs meant to safeguard their dead, to ensure their spirits moved on without disturbance. To mutilate a corpse was to commit an atrocity that went beyond war, for it meant defiling not just the body but the soul itself. It was a punishment that extended into the afterlife, ensuring that even in death, the enemy would find no peace. This fear, deeply ingrained in so many cultures, became a powerful weapon in itself. To know that defeat did not end in a simple grave, but in dismemberment and consumption, this was a terror that lingered. Yet, as time passed, most civilizations moved away from these practices, even those that once embraced them. The Tonkawa, for all their brutality, were not the first to abandon it. But not all societies chose to let go of these rites. Some held firm to the belief that strength could be absorbed, that fear could be instilled through ritualized violence. The Aztecs were among them. The great empire of Tenochtitlan stood as a marvel, its temples towering over the landscape, its canals and causeways rivaling the greatest cities of Europe. And yet, within its grandeur lay a custom that horrified outsiders. Ritual cannibalism was not merely a rumor. It was documented, described in detail by those who saw it firsthand. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who marched with Cortés into the heart of the empire, wrote of the practice, of how the arms and legs of sacrificial victims were severed and consumed. To the Spanish, who gazed upon Tenochtitlan with admiration, it was almost unthinkable that a civilization of such sophistication would hold on to a tradition so ancient, so primal. But to the Aztecs, it was not savagery, it was belief. It was power. It was a way to take from the fallen and give to the living, to fuel their strength with the flesh of those who had once stood against them. To the outside world, it was unrecognizable, something out of legend or myth, something closer to the fierce warriors of fiction than to the empire that stood before them. Yet it was real, and it was part of what made them feared. They seem almost like something out of legend, like the fierce Klingons from Star Trek, a people of discipline, driven by a warrior's code, yet still maintaining a structured society. They were not savages, not mindless brutes, but rather a civilization that had, in most respects, advanced beyond the chaos of raw violence. And yet, even as they built cities that awed those who saw them, they held on to the warrior traditions of their ancestors. While most cultures had long since moved past their most brutal customs, rites that once included cannibalism, infanticide, and human sacrifice, the Aztecs and the Tonkawa had not. It was a process that, for many societies, had taken centuries, even millennia. Over time, as civilizations expanded, as beliefs evolved, and as new influences reshaped their understanding of power and spirituality, many abandoned their older, bloodier ways. But for the Aztecs and the Tonkawa, the break never fully came. Why? That remains a question without a clear answer. Perhaps it was faith, the belief that their gods demanded such offerings. Perhaps it was fear, the need to project strength, to remind all who opposed them that defeat would mean more than just death. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something unknowable to those who did not live within these cultures. But whatever the reason, they were not alone. The accounts of ritual cannibalism are not exclusive to the Aztecs or the Tonkawa. Reports suggest that other groups, including the Lipan Apache, the Wichita, the Karankawa, and perhaps even the Comanche, may have engaged in similar practices. Oral traditions, passed down through generations, speak of ceremonies in which the flesh of an enemy was consumed, not out of desperation, not in the way of starving men, but as a ritual, an act meant to transfer strength from the fallen to the living. And then there is the case of the Anasazi. Unlike the others, the evidence here is not just written accounts or secondhand stories. It is physical, almost irrefutable. Analysis of an 850-year-old copper vessel has revealed traces of human protein, unmistakable in its composition. Even more damning, multiple samples of human waste left behind by the Anasazi contain the same markers, evidence that leaves no doubt about what had been consumed. There is only one way that such material could have ended up there. The reason this matters, why it is worth bringing up, is because the threshold of proof for labeling a people as cannibals is incredibly high. Historians do not make such claims lightly. It is not enough to have the word of one or two individuals, not unless there are many corroborating voices, as there were in the case of the Takua. Even then, skepticism remains. And perhaps that is a good thing. The weight of such an accusation is enormous, one that can permanently stain the legacy of an entire people. Throughout history, cultures have often been dehumanized by their enemies, reduced to nothing more than twisted caricatures of reality. There are countless examples of propaganda weaponized to paint an opposing group as monstrous, as something less than human. And for those who have often been portrayed as victims in the story of history, the accusation of cannibalism carries a particularly heavy burden. It is an instant, permanent black mark, a label that, whether true or not, separates a people from the rest of the world. It is why evidence must be overwhelming before such a judgment is made. The pattern is familiar, repeated time and again throughout history. When a powerful group seeks to expand, whether it be the conquistadors pushing deeper into the New World or American settlers claiming land in the West, dehumanization becomes a necessary tool. If the people who stand in the way can be cast as less than human, as savage and monstrous, then conquest is not just justified, it is framed as a moral duty. No one rallies to defend those who are labeled as barbarians, especially not if they are said to be the kind who would slaughter you in the night and feast on your remains. The fear of the other, of something so alien and horrifying, makes the act of taking their land seem like a necessity rather than an act of aggression. Because of this, in the modern era, skepticism naturally arises. We view the past with caution, recognizing that many of the accounts written by conquerors were shaped by self-interest. When there is no physical evidence, when the only proof comes from the words of men who stood to gain from demonizing their enemies, it is easy to dismiss these claims as fabrications, exaggerations meant to justify war and expansion. Stories of cannibalism, especially those told by outsiders, have often been written off as pure myth, a convenient fiction designed to strip a people of their humanity. But perhaps a more measured approach is warranted, one that does not outright dismiss these accounts, but instead places them under scrutiny. History is filled with moments where what was once assumed to be false later turned out to have some grounding in reality. One of the most famous examples comes from Christopher Columbus himself. In his writings, he described encountering vicious cannibal warriors in the Caribbean, painting them as a threat to both his men and the more peaceful indigenous groups they encountered. For centuries, many modern historians dismissed these claims, believing them to be a transparent lie, a way to rationalize further aggression, to present himself as a protector rather than an invader. Given the long history of European justifications for colonial violence, it was hardly an unreasonable assumption. Yet, recent archaeological discoveries have complicated this view. Just as the analysis of ancient coprolites provided physical evidence of ritual cannibalism among certain tribes in the American Southwest, new findings have lent credibility to Columbus's descriptions. The remains of human bones, displaying clear signs of having been processed for consumption, suggest that at least some of what he described may not have been fiction after all. It is a reminder that myths, particularly those tied to cultural memory, are often not outright fabrications, but rather convenient truths that are exaggerated, weaponized, or distorted, but still rooted in something real. This does not mean that every accusation of cannibalism throughout history was accurate, nor does it erase the role such claims played in the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. But it does complicate the narrative. Cannibalism was not an unheard-of practice in the Americas, and while it may not have been widespread, it was also not entirely alien to the cultures that existed there. Even those who did not engage in the practice themselves would have understood it, known of its existence, and perhaps even feared it. Whether as reality or legend, it remained part of the world they lived in. At the Spanish mission in San Antonio, priests tasked with converting indigenous peoples to Christianity added an unusual question to their catechism. Have you eaten human flesh? Such a question was not included by accident. It was not a hypothetical concern, nor a fabrication meant to frighten. It was there because the priests had encountered it, because it was real enough to warrant asking. The existence of this question raises another. If the act of consuming human flesh was not entirely unheard of, then why did so many tribes unite in opposition to the Tonkawa? The answer likely lies in two key factors. First, it was not simply that the Tonkawa engaged in such practices, it was how they did it. While other tribes may have practiced cannibalism as part of deeply ritualized ceremonies shrouded in religious or spiritual meaning, the Tonkawa were different. They did not attempt to mask it in tradition or sacred rites. They did not conduct their acts in secrecy, nor did they soften the horror of it with layers of mysticism. Instead, they were open, unashamed, and perhaps even defiant about what they did. Their reputation was one of ruthless brutality, and the evidence of their deeds was worn for all to see. Warriors adorned themselves with the finger bones and severed ears of their fallen enemies, displaying them like trophies of conquest. Even their children were raised among these symbols of violence. Dolls crafted for young Tonkawa contained fragments of scalps taken from their victims. To those outside their tribe, these acts were not just gruesome, they were brazen. It was not just their enemies who took notice. Other tribes in the region came to associate the Tonkawa with a level of cruelty that surpassed even the most violent traditions of war. In the American Southwest, their name carried a specific weight. Other groups referred to them with words that translated to man-eater. They were not whispered about in uncertain terms, not accused in passing rumors. The belief in their cannibalistic nature was widespread, spoken openly by those who had encountered them. More than any other group, the Tonkawa were singled out. If other tribes engaged in ritual cannibalism, it was often done with strict rules, with carefully maintained customs that dictated how and why it was carried out. But the Tonkawa were different. Their actions lacked the restraint seen in others, their practices too overt to be ignored. And so, rather than fear alone, it was revulsion that turned neighboring tribes against them. What others sought to hide within ceremony, the Tonkawa seemed to flaunt. In 1840, a Texan told a story that has endured, a chilling account of what he claimed to have seen firsthand. He spoke of a battle where the Tonkawa warriors had defeated a Comanche, his body left in the aftermath of the fight. But the killing was only the beginning. He watched as they took the fallen warrior and methodically carved his body into pieces, the severed portions gathered like ingredients for a meal. They brought forth a large pot, filling it with water, corn, and potatoes, then added the human remains to the boiling mixture. The pot was placed over the fire, and as the flames licked the metal, the scent of cooking flesh filled the air. When the meal was ready, there was no ceremony, no hushed reverence or spiritual offering. Instead, the Tonkawa treated it as if it were nothing more than a routine feast. The broth and its grisly contents were ladled out, piece by piece, into the waiting hands of each tribal member. No hesitation, no sign of discomfort. They ate until nothing remained. To those who heard such stories, there was something deeply unsettling about how the Tonkawa approached the act. Other tribes that had engaged in cannibalism often did so within the confines of ritual, their actions wrapped in spiritual or symbolic meaning. But the Tonkawa lacked that veil of tradition, that sense of justification that made it more palatable, even to those who might not have condemned it outright. The way they carried it out blurred the line between ritual and something far darker, something that seemed almost pathological. And yet, perhaps such assumptions are unfair. Perhaps the stories were exaggerated, shaped by fear and rumor, passed down and reshaped into something worse than reality. After all, if the Tokwa were as reviled as these accounts suggested, then why did other tribes not always treat them as outcasts? In the decades leading up to the 1862 massacre, they were not universally shunned. In fact, at times, they were embraced. The Comanche, despite their deep-rooted animosities with many groups, once called upon the Tokwa to aid them in their campaign to exterminate the Apache. The Caddo had even raided alongside them just a few years before. So what changed? What turned former allies against them? The answer, as history often proves, was politics and shifting alliances. The Tokwa had made a choice, one that placed them on a path that many of their neighbors could not accept. They had formed bonds with the Americans, and that, more than their practices, more than the rumors of what they did, may have been their greatest transgression. That's reason 2. Before the Civil War, the Tokwa, a smaller tribe caught in the shifting tides of power, understood the reality of their situation. They saw, as many did, that the native tribes stood little chance against the relentless wave of European expansion. Survival was not a matter of standing firm, it was about choosing the right side. And so they placed their faith in those they believed would ultimately prevail. It was not an uncommon strategy. Across the West, alliances between indigenous groups were rarely built on sentiment. They were driven by necessity, by the cold calculations of survival. No tribe could afford to make choices based on history or shared culture alone. What mattered was what best served them at that moment. And for the Tokwa, the answer was clear. The expansion of American settlers was unstoppable. The great, powerful Plains tribes, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, were too focused on their own struggles to save them. If the Tokwa were going to endure, they needed a stronger ally, one with the power to offer protection. By the 1850s, they had fully committed to this path. Texans came to rely on the Tokwa as scouts and warriors, enlisting them in campaigns against other tribes and against Mexicans. But such service came with consequences. To be used as a weapon against their own people made them enemies of the very communities they had once stood among. It was a precarious position, one that left them isolated, distrusted by those who had once been allies. It was a choice that left them with no safe path forward. Even under American protection, they remained on the fringes of the plains, close enough to the warring tribes to be a target, yet not fully embraced by the settlers they served. Unless they were granted meaningful and lasting protection, violence was inevitable. That moment came in 1862. As conflict between the warring factions of America and native tribes escalated, Confederate leadership at Fort Cobb was forced to flee. The Tokwa, who had initially aligned themselves with the Texans, remained loyal when the Texans became Confederates. But their allegiance meant little in the chaos that followed. With the departure of Confederate forces and the lack of oversight from the Indian Agency, the region was left in a fragile state. The vacuum of power left the Tokwa vulnerable, their position more precarious than ever. Then came the accusation. The Caddo, who had not allied with the Confederacy, claimed that the Tokwa had murdered and cannibalized a young boy. Details were scarce, and whether or not the Tokwa were actually responsible was uncertain. But in that moment, the truth did not matter. What mattered was that the divisions between the tribes had already run too deep. The Tokwa were no longer seen as kin or allies. They had chosen their side, and now, with the world around them unraveling, there was no one left to stand beside them. There was no path toward reconciliation. The tensions between the Tokwa and the other tribes had reached a breaking point, and there was no turning back. Among groups like the Comanche, the accusations made by the Caddo felt not just plausible, but inevitable. The Tokwa already carried a dark reputation, one that had been reinforced over the years by accounts of their actions. Just a few years earlier, they had been accused of cannibalizing 2 Comanche warriors during a joint raid with the Caddo. Now, with fresh allegations against them, the anger that had long simmered beneath the surface was about to erupt. These were not times in which tribes needed much of an excuse to go on a raid. The frontier was a landscape of constant conflict, shifting alliances, and old scores waiting to be settled. But the Tokwa were different. Their alleged acts of cannibalism were seen as something beyond the accepted rules of war, something that set them apart in a way that made them unredeemable in the eyes of their neighbors. The latest accusation, whether true or not, came at the worst possible time. The Tokwa were already despised for their alliance with the whites. They had chosen to stand with the settlers, with the Texans, and now with the Confederates. To the tribes who still fought against the encroachment of American expansion, this alone was a betrayal. And the one thing that might have kept them safe, the fort they had camped near for protection, was failing them. It offered little real security, a weak shield against the storm that was coming. The entire situation was a tinderbox, and the accusation was the spark that ignited it. Joseph Cannoli, in his article A Terrible Truth, The Tonkawa Massacre of 1862, described the accusation not as a singular event, but as part of a larger strategy. He wrote, "The Kiowan Comanche attached the charge in order to establish the Tokwa as pariahs and scapegoats. For all who heard the charge, it did not matter if the Tokwa were guilty or not. The common attitude apparently supplied its own confirmation. The claim had served its purpose. It was the justification that their enemies needed. Once it had been spoken, the outcome was inevitable. Whether the Tokwa had truly committed the crime no longer mattered. They were marked, and the time for vengeance had arrived." Before closing this chapter, however, there are a few things worth considering, details left unsaid that add weight to the tragedy that followed. The Tokwa had a reputation, a dark one, a feared one, and yet the Texans were still willing to work with them. That fact alone is worth considering. The frontier was filled with complex alliances, ones shaped by necessity rather than morality. But in the hierarchy of human atrocities, ritual cannibalism is undoubtedly among the most unforgivable. It sits at a level of horror that few other acts reach. And because of that, I find myself uncertain about the Tokwa or any other group against whom such accusations were credibly made. Perhaps it's natural to try and view cultures from the past with some degree of leniency, to understand them within the context of their time rather than through the lens of modern morality. But even with that perspective, there are lines that feel impossible to overlook. I struggle to offer any defense for the cannibal allies of slave owners. So imagine for a moment that you are a tribe living in this region. Your land is near the Tokwa. Your people are within reach of their war parties. What would you do? What choice would you make? The Comanche knew exactly what to do. Remember the story I opened with, the one where the Comanche discovered the Tokwa cooking one of their own. The story doesn't end there. The Comanche did not simply witness the act and walk away. They took action. They managed to capture some of the Tokwa warriors who had taken part in the gruesome feast. And what followed was swift, brutal, and unrelenting. Lehman recounts it in chilling detail. "We scalped them, amputated their arms, cut off their legs, cut out their tongues, and threw their mangled bodies and limbs upon their own campfire, put on more brushwood, and piled the living, dying, and dead Tokwas on the fire. Some of them were able to flinch and work as a worm, and some were able to speak and plead for mercy. We piled them up, put on more wood, and danced around in great glee as we saw the grease and blood run from their bodies, and were delighted to see them swell up and hear the hide pop as they would burst in the fire. It was retribution, carried out without hesitation. But as horrifying as it was not an act that stood outside the norms of war in this era. For a captured enemy, this was the fate many could expect, whether at the hands of the Comanche, the Tokwa, or any number of other warring nations. And this is not just about Native American history. The capacity for cruelty is not unique to any one people, nor is it bound by geography. The pages of history are filled with acts that make the skin crawl, horrors committed by Europeans, by Asians, by Africans, by every civilization that has ever wielded power over another. There is no shortage of examples, no monopoly on brutality. Where all of this falls in the grand hierarchy of human atrocity, that is something each person must decide for themselves. But that's enough for today. This was a dark one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you have ideas for what you'd like to see next, let me know.